I should have known something was wrong the moment Bessie turned away from the water. In 30 years of farming, I'd never seen a cow refuse fresh pond water on a scorching July afternoon. She stood there, massive head swaying, nostrils flaring as she caught some scent that made her back away with surprising urgency. The other cattle followed her lead, clustering near the fence line instead of their usual watering spot. I watched from the porch, iced tea sweating in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Cows are creatures of habit. They'd been drinking from that pond since I inherited this land from my father 20 years ago. I set down my glass and walked across the pasture, boots crunching on the sun-baked grass. The pond looked normal enough from a distance, same murky green surface, same cattails swaying in the evening breeze. But as I got closer, I caught it too. A smell. Not the usual earthy scent of pond water and algae, but something else, something chemical and sharp that made my nose burn. The water's surface seemed different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. Maybe it was the way the setting sun reflected off it, or the unusual stillness where there should have been the gentle lapping of small waves. I knelt at the edge, studying the dark water more closely. That's when I noticed the fish, or rather the lack of them. Usually, this time of evening brought bluegill and bass to the surface, creating gentle ripples as they fed. Tonight, the water was eerily calm, like a sheet of black glass. I dipped my finger in and immediately jerked it back. The water felt wrong, somehow thicker than it should be. Standing up, I wiped my hand on my jeans and glanced back at the cattle. They were watching me, their large eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost like warning. That night, I couldn't shake the image of my cattle's strange behavior. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy rotation, listening to the usual chorus of crickets and tree frogs. But something was missing from the symphony. The gentle splash of night feeders breaking the pond's surface. Around 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen window that overlooked the pasture. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver relief. I could see the dark outline of the pond, perfectly still, and the shadowy forms of my cattle huddled as far from it as the pasture would allow. I was about to turn away when I saw it, a flash of light near the pond. Not electric light, but something softer, like a flashlight beam. My heart rate picked up as I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to get a better look. The light moved in a deliberate pattern, sweeping back and forth across the water's surface. Someone was out there. I grabbed my father's old shotgun from the hall closet, checked that it was loaded, and slipped out the back door. The summer air was thick with humidity, and my bare feet were immediately soaked with dew. I crept across the yard, using the barn's shadow for cover, my eyes fixed on that moving light. As I got closer, I could make out a figure crouched at the pond's edge. They wore dark clothing and moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this before. I was maybe 50 feet away when the wind shifted, and I caught that chemical smell again, stronger now, making my eyes water. The figure suddenly straightened and looked directly at me. For a moment, we stared at each other across the moonlit pasture. Then they turned and ran, disappearing into the tree line at the property's edge with surprising speed. I stood there for several minutes, heart pounding, before approaching the spot where they'd been crouched. The ground was disturbed, muddy, and that sharp chemical odor was almost overwhelming. The next morning, I called Sheriff Morrison. We'd gone to high school together, and I trusted him to take my concerns seriously. He arrived within an hour, his patrol car kicking up dust clouds as it wound up my gravel driveway. "Jim," he said, stepping out and adjusting his hat against the morning sun, "you look like hell." I felt like it too. The sleepless night had left me jittery and paranoid. "Someone was on my property last night, dumping something in the pond. The cattle won't go near the water." Morrison walked with me to the pasture, his practiced eyes taking in the scene. The cattle were still clustered at the far end, and the pond remained unnaturally still. When we reached the water's edge, he whistled low. "That's quite a smell," he said, pulling out a handkerchief to cover his nose. "You have any idea what it might be?" I shook my head. "Nothing good. I've been farming this land for decades, Sheriff. I know what normal pond water smells like." He knelt where I'd seen the figure the night before, examining the disturbed ground. "These footprints are fresh," he said, pointing to several clear boot impressions in the mud. "Size 10 or 11, I'd guess. Work boots by the tread pattern." Morrison stood and surveyed the pond again. "I'm going to call the environmental folks, have them test the water. In the meantime, keep your cattle away from it, and don't drink from your well if it's anywhere near here." "My well's on the other side of the property," I said, though his words sent a chill down my spine. "You think it's that serious?" "Could be nothing," he said, but his expression suggested otherwise. "Could be someone dumping motor oil or something equally stupid, but better safe than sorry." After he left, I spent the morning setting up temporary fencing to keep the cattle completely away from the pond. They seemed relieved, if cattle could feel such things, settling into their new grazing area with visible contentment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much worse. 3 days later, Morrison called with results that made my blood run cold. I was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when my phone buzzed. "Jim, you sitting down?" His voice was tight, professional in a way that immediately put me on edge. "What did they find?" "Industrial chemicals. Specifically, a cocktail of heavy metals and organic solvents that shouldn't exist anywhere near a farm pond. The lab tech said it was like someone mixed paint thinner, battery acid, and God knows what else." I sank onto a hay bale, suddenly dizzy. "How much?" "Enough to kill every living thing in that water, and probably anything that drank from it regularly. Your cattle saved their own lives by refusing to drink." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If my cattle had continued their normal routine, they'd be dead or dying by now. Dozens of animals, worth more than my annual income, poisoned by some midnight visitor with unknown motives. "Any idea who might want to do this?" Morrison asked. I thought about it, running through the short list of people who might have grievances against me. There was the boundary dispute with my neighbor Thompson, but that had been settled amicably years ago. The bank loan situation had been stressful, but hardly worth committing what amounted to agricultural terrorism. "I can't think of anyone," I said finally. This is attempted murder, isn't it? Of my livestock, I mean. A minimum, it's criminal mischief, destruction of property and illegal dumping of hazardous materials. Could be attempted animal cruelty charges too. We're treating it as a serious felony. After hanging up, I walked back to the fenced-off pond. Even from a distance, I could see that the water level had dropped noticeably. Whatever had been dumped was apparently eating away at the pond itself, the chemicals so corrosive they were changing the very structure of the water body. That night, I didn't even pretend to try sleeping. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off, shotgun across my lap, watching the pond through the window. My vigil paid off. Around midnight, I saw the light again, that same soft glow moving near the pond's edge. This time I was ready. I changed the lock on my back door, left it unlocked for quick exit, and positioned myself where I had a clear view of the entire pasture. The figure moved differently this time, more cautiously, occasionally stopping to look toward the house. They seemed aware they might be watched. I waited until they were fully committed to whatever they were doing before slipping outside. I moved through the shadows more carefully than before, using the barn and outbuildings for cover. The night was cooler, with a breeze that carried that chemical smell in nauseating waves. As I got closer, I could see the figure more clearly, medium height, wearing all black, with what looked like a backpack or bag slung across their shoulders. They were pouring something into the water from a large container, moving in a methodical pattern around the pond's perimeter. The sound was barely audible, a gentle glug 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 as liquid met liquid. But each pour sent up a small cloud of vapor that glowed faintly in the moonlight. I was maybe 30 feet away when my boot hit a loose rock. The small sound carried clearly in the still air, and the figure's head snapped up immediately. This time, instead of running, they stood their ground. "I know you're there," a voice called out. Male, middle-aged, with an accent I couldn't place. "No point hiding." I stepped into the moonlight, shotgun ready but not quite aimed. "This is my property. You're trespassing and destroying my land." The figure straightened, and I could see he was wearing some kind of mask or respirator. "Your land?" He laughed, a sound without humor. "This land doesn't belong to anyone anymore, not after what's buried underneath it." "What are you talking about?" But he was already moving, backing toward the tree line with surprising speed. "You should leave," he called over his shoulder, "before it's too late for you, too." Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness like smoke. I didn't call Morrison right away. Instead, I spent the rest of the night thinking about the stranger's words. What's buried underneath it? The implication was clear. Something was hidden beneath my pond, something worth poisoning the water to. What? Destroy evidence? Drive me away? At dawn, I walked the perimeter of my property, looking at it with new eyes. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather had bought it in 1952, a struggling dairy farm that he'd slowly turned profitable. My father had expanded it, adding the pond in the 1970s to provide water for the cattle during dry spells. But what had been here before my grandfather bought it? I drove into town and spent the morning at the county records office, digging through old maps and property deeds. What I found made me understand why someone might want to keep secrets buried. According to the records, my land had previously been owned by Meridian Chemical Company from 1948 to 1952. They'd operated a small processing plant there, handling what the documents vaguely described as industrial waste management. The plant had been shut down following what the records called regulatory compliance issues, and the land sold quickly to my grandfather. I stared at the old survey map, comparing it to my mental picture of the property. The chemical plant had been located almost exactly where my pond was now. My father, unknowingly, had excavated right into what had once been an industrial site. The pieces were falling into place. Someone knew what was buried there. Chemicals, waste, maybe even bodies if the regulatory violations had been serious enough. The midnight poisoner wasn't trying to hurt my cattle. He was trying to make the pond unusable, contaminated beyond any possibility of investigation or excavation. But why now? The plant had been closed for over 70 years. What had changed? I drove home with my mind racing, but as I turned into my driveway, I saw something that stopped my heart. Morrison's patrol car was parked by my house, and he was standing in the pasture, staring at the pond with an expression of horror on his face. "Don't come any closer," Morrison called as I approached. His face was pale, and he held one hand over his nose. "The water levels dropped enough that things are visible." I ignored his warning and walked to the pond's edge. What I saw there would haunt my dreams for years to come. The chemical contamination had eaten away at the pond's natural bottom, exposing what lay beneath. Partially dissolved metal drums, their contents long since leaked into the surrounding soil, and among them, unmistakable even after decades underwater, the pale gleam of human bones. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, stepping back involuntarily. "I've called the state police," Morrison said, his voice tight. "This is way beyond my jurisdiction now. We're looking at a hazmat situation combined with what appears to be a mass grave." I counted at least 6 skulls visible in the exposed mud, along with the twisted remains of what might have been industrial equipment. The chemical smell was overwhelming now, a cocktail of decades-old toxins finally exposed to air. "How many people knew about this?" I asked. Morrison shook his head. "Could be just one person, could be dozens. Companies like Meridian had a lot of employees, a lot of people who might have known what really went on here. And someone's been poisoning the pond to keep it hidden. Looks that way. Probably figured if the water was toxic enough, nobody would ever think to drain it or investigate what's underneath." We stood in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to process the magnitude of what we were looking at. This wasn't just illegal dumping or animal cruelty. This was evidence of mass murder, hidden for over 70 years. "The person I saw," I said finally. "He told me I should leave before it was too late for me too." Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. "You think he'll be back?" "I think he's desperate. Whatever this is, it's worth killing to keep secret. And now that the truth is coming out..." I didn't need to finish the thought. We both understood that I was now a liability, a witness to something that powerful people had spent decades concealing. The state police arrived within hours, followed by EPA hazmat teams and what looked like half the federal government. My quiet farm became a crime scene, buzzing with activity, as investigators in full protective gear began the careful process of draining and excavating the contaminated pond. I was moved to a motel in town for my own safety, but I couldn't stop thinking about what lay buried in my backyard. The initial count of remains had risen to 12, with more discoveries expected as the excavation continued. The chemicals weren't just industrial waste. They were a deliberate attempt to dissolve evidence, to make bodies disappear completely. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI visited me at the motel that evening. She was young, serious, and obviously dealing with something much bigger than a simple poisoning case. "Mr. Patterson, we need to talk about what you've seen and who might know you've seen it," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "This case connects to a federal investigation that's been ongoing for 15 years. 15 years. Meridian Chemical didn't just process industrial waste. They were a front for organized crime, specifically a family operation that used the facility to dispose of problems. We've been tracking similar sites across 3 states, but this is the first one where we found intact remains. The implications sent a chill through me. I wasn't just dealing with one desperate individual. I was caught in the middle of a decades-old cover-up involving organized crime and mass murder. "The person you've seen," Agent Chen continued, "we believe he's Thomas Meridian, grandson of the company's founder. He's been systematically contaminating these sites to prevent exactly what's happening here. Discovery of evidence that could bring down what's left of the family operation. So he'll keep coming back. Almost certainly, these remains could testify to murders spanning decades. There are probably living witnesses who could be charged, money that could be seized, convictions that could destroy the organization completely." She leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mr. Patterson, you're not safe. Not until we have Thomas Meridian in custody, and maybe not even then. These people have been killing to protect this secret for 70 years. That night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar motel bed, listening to every sound in the hallway, every car that passed in the parking lot. I thought about my quiet life, my simple concerns about cattle and weather and crop prices. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by the knowledge that I was marked for death by people who had turned murder into a business. The next morning brought news that confirmed my worst fears. Agent Chen called at dawn, her voice tight with urgency. "Thomas Meridian's car was spotted 20 miles from your farm last night. We have roadblocks up, but he knows this area better than we do. He could be anywhere." I dressed quickly and met her at the police station, where a joint task force had set up a command center. Maps covered every available surface, marked with locations of known Meridian chemical sites, possible hideouts and escape routes. The scale of the operation was staggering. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, studying a timeline that stretched back to the 1940s. "3 generations," Agent Chen replied, "starting with Vincent Meridian, who founded the company as a legitimate chemical processor, but quickly realized the money was in making problems disappear. His son expanded the operation, and now we're dealing with the grandson, who spent his entire adult life cleaning up his family's messes." Detective Morrison joined us, his face grim. "We found his campsite in the woods about a mile from your property. He's been watching the farm for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the right opportunity." "To do what?" "Initially, probably just to poison the pond enough to prevent any investigation, but now," Morrison shrugged, "now he's looking at life in prison if those remains can be connected to his family. That makes him extremely dangerous." I spent the day in protective custody, but my mind kept drifting back to my cattle, my land, my entire life disrupted by secrets buried before I was even born. It felt surreal, like being trapped in someone else's nightmare. Around noon, Agent Chen received a call that made her face go white. She hung up and turned to me with an expression I'll never forget. "He's taken a hostage," she said quietly. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. He's demanding to meet with you alone at the pond site tonight." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. Thomas Meridian had moved beyond contamination and intimidation to outright kidnapping. The situation had escalated to a level where people were going to die. "We can't let you do it," Morrison said immediately. "It's obviously a trap." But I was already thinking about Mrs. Thompson, a widow in her 70s who lived alone and had never hurt anyone in her life. She was paying the price for my discovery, suffering because of secrets that had nothing to do with her. Despite the protests of every law enforcement officer involved, I knew I had to face Thomas Meridian. Mrs. Thompson's life hung in the balance, and I was the only person who could potentially negotiate her release. The plan was carefully coordinated. I would meet Meridian at the pond site at midnight, wearing a concealed microphone and GPS tracker. Sniper teams would be positioned around the perimeter, and the entire conversation would be recorded. If negotiations failed, they were authorized to take lethal action. As I walked across my moonlit pasture toward the contaminated pond, I could smell the chemical odor even stronger than before. The excavation had exposed decades of buried toxins, creating an almost otherworldly landscape of disturbed earth and hazmat equipment. Meridian was waiting for me at the pond's edge. Mrs. Thompson bound and gagged beside him. Even in the darkness, I could see the family resemblance to the old photographs I'd seen. The same sharp features, the same cold eyes that had watched over decades of murder and disposal. "Mr. Patterson," he said as I approached, his voice calm and conversational. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the dramatic circumstances, but you've created a serious problem for me." "Let her go," I said, stopping about 10 feet away. "She has nothing to do with this." "Unfortunately, she does now. Just like you do. The moment that Pond started revealing its secrets, you both became witnesses to something that can never see the light of day." He gestured to the excavation site where protective tarps covered the exposed remains. "Do you have any idea how many families would be destroyed by what's buried here? How many legitimate businesses would be ruined by association with my grandfathers? Extracurricular activities? You mean the murders?" Meridian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I prefer to think of it as problem-solving. People who crossed the family, who threatened our operations, who knew too much. They all ended up here. It was efficient, clean, and absolutely permanent." I could see Mrs. Thompson's eyes wide with terror above her gag, and anger began to replace my fear. This man was talking about mass murder as if it was simple business practice. "Times change," I said. "You can't cover this up forever." "Perhaps not, but I can certainly eliminate the immediate witnesses." His hand moved to something at his belt, and I tensed, knowing that sniper scopes were trained on him from multiple angles. What Thomas Meridian pulled from his belt wasn't a weapon, it was a small device that began beeping steadily, a detonator. You see, Mr. Patterson, contaminating the pond was never the real plan. It was just meant to buy time while I prepared a more permanent solution. My blood turned to ice as I understood what he was saying. You've planted explosives. Enough to collapse the entire excavation site, bury the evidence so deep it will never be found again, and eliminate anyone unfortunate enough to be standing nearby. His smile widened, including federal agents positioned around the perimeter. I could hear Agent Chen's voice crackling through my earpiece, urgent commands being given to evacuation teams. But there was no time. If Meridian pressed that button, dozens of people would die, and 70 years of evidence would be lost forever. You're insane, I said, taking a step closer despite the danger. This won't solve anything. People already know what's here. Perhaps. But without physical evidence, without witnesses, it becomes just another conspiracy theory. The Meridian family has weathered such storms before. Mrs. Thompson made a muffled sound behind her gag, struggling against her bonds. Meridian glanced at her with the casual indifference of someone who had stopped seeing victims as human beings long ago. My grandfather built this empire by understanding that some problems require permanent solutions, he continued. My father expanded it by recognizing that legitimate business could provide cover for necessary activities. And I've preserved it by cleaning up loose ends that threatened our legacy, like the people buried in my pond. Among others, competing families, federal informants, journalists who asked too many questions. Over the decades, this site has served its purpose admirably, but all good things must come to an end. His finger moved toward the detonator's trigger, and I realized that talking wasn't going to save anyone. The man standing before me was the product of 3 generations of violence and murder, someone who saw mass killing as a reasonable business decision. I had perhaps seconds to act before he destroyed everything and everyone in a final, desperate attempt to preserve his family's secrets. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that innocent lives hung in the balance, gave me a clarity I'd never experienced before. Time seemed to slow as I watched Meridian's finger tighten on the detonator. Mrs. Thompson's terrified eyes met mine, and I saw my own death reflected there. But I also saw something else, a slight loosening of her bonds, as if she'd been working to free herself while we talked. Wait, I said, raising my hands. If you're going to kill us anyway, at least tell me why. Why my land? Why now, after all these years? Meridian paused, his ego unable to resist the opportunity to explain his cleverness. A federal task force has been systematically investigating Meridian chemical sites for 15 years. This was the last undiscovered location, and satellite imagery showed unusual chemical signatures in the soil around your pond. It was only a matter of time before they obtained a search warrant. So you decided to destroy the evidence first? Initially, yes. The plan was to make the pond so toxic that no one would ever want to investigate what lay beneath. But your cattle's behavior drew attention. And then you started asking questions. His expression hardened. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. As he spoke, I noticed Mrs. Thompson had managed to work one hand partially free. She was an old farm woman, tougher than she looked, and she'd been listening to our conversation with growing understanding of what was at stake. You made one mistake, I said, playing for time. You assumed I was working alone. Meridian's eyes narrowed. The federal agents, they're all within the blast radius. This entire area will be sterilized. Not the federal agents, the media. It was a bluff, but it worked. Meridian's confidence flickered for just a moment, long enough for Mrs. Thompson to make her move. Her partially freed hand shot out, grabbing the detonator and yanking it away from him with surprising strength. Meridian lunged for the device, and I threw myself forward, tackling him around the waist. We went down hard, rolling in the contaminated mud at the pond's edge. The detonator flew from Mrs. Thompson's grasp, landing somewhere in the darkness. Meridian was stronger than he looked, fighting with the desperation of someone who knew capture meant life in prison. His hands went for my throat, and I could feel his thumbs pressing against my windpipe. But I had advantages too. This was my land, and I'd spent decades doing physical labor that had left me stronger than I looked. I managed to roll him over, pinning his arms, just as floodlights suddenly blazed around the perimeter. Agent Chen's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Thomas Meridian, you are surrounded. Release your hostages and surrender immediately." Meridian looked up at me with pure hatred. "This doesn't end here," he whispered. "There are others. The family has resources you can't imagine." But his threats felt empty now, the desperate words of a man whose 70-year conspiracy had finally collapsed. The aftermath moved quickly. Bomb disposal teams found and disarmed 13 separate explosive devices that Meridian had planted around the excavation site, enough destructive power to level several city blocks. Mrs. Thompson was treated for shock and minor injuries, but recovered fully. And Thomas Meridian, the last guardian of his family's deadly secrets, was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and terrorism. The excavation of my pond continued for 6 months, ultimately revealing the remains of 43 victims spanning 5 decades. DNA evidence linked many of them to missing persons cases that had gone cold decades ago, finally providing closure to families who had never known what happened to their loved ones. The Meridian chemical investigation expanded to sites in 7 states, resulting in dozens of arrests and the dismantling of one of the country's oldest organized crime families. Federal prosecutors called it the most significant breakthrough in their ongoing fight against institutional corruption and murder. As for me, I eventually returned to my farm. Though the pond was gone forever, the entire area declared a Superfund site requiring years of environmental remediation. The government compensation was generous, enough to relocate my operation to cleaner land and rebuild what I'd lost. But some things can't be rebuilt. The innocence of rural life, the simple trust that your neighbors aren't harboring deadly secrets, the belief that justice eventually prevails, those were casualties of my discovery that will never fully heal. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that first evening when Bessie refused to drink from the pond. Animals have instincts we've forgotten, senses that can detect danger long before our rational minds recognize it. If I'd paid attention sooner, if I'd trusted what my cattle were trying to tell me, maybe I could have prevented the terror that followed. But maybe not. Some secrets are so deeply buried, so carefully protected, that they require extraordinary circumstances to come to light. My pond just happened to be the place where 70 years of carefully concealed murder finally surfaced, where the weight of accumulated evil became impossible to hide. The land is healing now, slowly reclaiming itself from decades of contamination. New grass grows where the pond once stood, and my cattle, wiser than their owner, graze peacefully in pastures far from that cursed ground. Life continues, but it continues with the knowledge that evil can hide in the most unexpected places, waiting patiently for its moment of discovery. Thank you for listening to this story. The truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction, and sometimes it takes the instincts of simple farm animals to reveal secrets that powerful people have spent lifetimes concealing. I hope this tale has entertained you and perhaps reminded you to pay attention to the warnings that surround us, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. Please write in the comments below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from, And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the dark corners of human nature and the courage it takes to bring truth to light.